Hi, my name's David Roof. Welcome back to Rooftop Recordings home recording series. This is episode 2, where we're going to be talking today about drum mics with multiple microphones. Our first episode last time, we did single microphone drum recording. We tried a bunch of different positions and heard what worked, what left us with some challenges. We're going to take what we heard there and apply that today to multiple mic setups. So be sure to click the notification bell, like, comment, share with your friends, find me on social media, and without further ado, let's get to the first mic setup. All right, here we are at the drum set. Last time we tried a bunch of different single mic positions. So when you're adding a second mic, your first thought may be stereo. Let's just go stereo on an overhead and capture the whole drum kit, or stereo behind, or stereo out front. And that can definitely work. So we're going to try each of the three of those real briefly, and then I'm going to show you something that I think would probably work better. All right, so stereo overhead sounds pretty balanced. The kick drum doesn't have a ton of power, but all in all, it's usable. If you need stereo, if you're playing something quiet and sensitive, or maybe jazz where the kick drum is not as big and powerful as it would be in a rock record, that could be a fine technique to use. Let's hear some of these other positions. So out front of the drum kit, it's a roomier kind of sound. It's a more whole-bodied version of the drum kit. Seems a little more classic rock, Led Zeppelin-y to me. If you want vibe, I know that if you take that sort of a drum miking and put some EQ and compression on it, you're going to get a really nice kind of raucous, dirty tone that could be really right for certain music. Again, it's all about your ears, your personal taste, what you want to hear out of the drums. So kind of interesting. So, sounds pretty balanced, sounds pretty full. There's more of a kick drum definition here, but it still doesn't quite have the power and punch that I think I would want for most rock and roll. But I think there is a better way, as long as you don't need stereo, that with only 2 mics, you could make the whole drum set work a lot more effectively. Let's check that out. Two microphones, overhead kick drum or front of drum kit low. So we lost stereo, but we gained power. The snare drum, the kick drum. In mono, everything has a real tight focus to it that I really like. In a mix, it's going to leave more room for guitars to be off to the sides or reverb tails. There's all kinds of things that'll happen with the drums not taking up the entire width of the stereo image. So if you only have 2 mics available, this is a really good technique. We're going to make another video after this one to talk about treatment of these signals. These are all raw signals, microphone into preamp, no compression, no equalization, no filtering of the low end, nothing. These are just raw sources of the microphone. I think it's really important when you're recording to try to get the sound coming off of the mic or into the mic to be as close to what you want the record to sound like at the end as possible. Sometimes that means you should run it through a compressor or run it through an outboard EQ. Sometimes you're going to have to process plugins, but if you can get the instrument into the microphone, into the right microphone, and have it sound like your final result, you're ahead of the game. So that's our goal, but let's hear what happens with more mics. All right, so we have stereo back. We have big, punchy kick drum. We have crisp, crackly snare. This is getting into a lot more of what we expect out of professionally recorded drums. The toms are still a little distant, which that's what's going to happen if you only have overheads and not tight tom mics. You can hear that presence of having the tight mic right on the kick and snare. We're getting there. Let's hear what this sounds like with Glyn Johns. And by the way, if you only have 3 microphones, you could do stereo overhead with a front kick mic. You could do single overhead snare kick. Feel free to get creative and use what you have, whatever that may be. Oh, Glyn Johns, responsible for so many great recordings. I really hear the toms with a lot more definition now. Depending on how distant you go with those, you can bring those toms very up front, almost as if they'd been tight mic'd. I've used this specific technique on a lot of recordings. There's a band I've worked with, Tyler Rigdon, in the second arrangement, where we've done nearly all the drums for that project with Glyn Johns plus kick and snare. Really great. So let's check out the 6 mics. All right, I want to talk just briefly about the Glyn Johns mic technique, but you don't need to listen to me talk about it. In the links below, I'm going to have a link to a YouTube video where Glyn Johns talks about this drum miking method that bears his name. And according to Glyn Johns, the distance from the snare for the 2 mics is not important, although you hear that all the time. So anyway, the gist of what the Glyn Johns mic technique is about, he often recorded drums with 4 microphones. And one would be overhead in sort of a traditional spot. He would go somewhere over the rack tom and the snare drum. Actually, I've got this a little bit too far towards the snare right now, so I'm going to back that up so it's more over the tom. This is mostly going to capture the left side of the drum kit. The second microphone we have over here on this short stand, it looks down at the kick and the snare over the floor tom, and it's going to capture the left side. You can alter this a little bit if you need less of a crash cymbal here. If you've got toms too close, you could go back a little more distance. For me, I find that about a foot off of the floor tom, sometimes 18 inches or 2 feet off of the floor tom is good. Now, Glyn Johns didn't think it was important to balance distance from the kick and snare. I do find that a little more important. I like it. So a handy cable of any sort, you hold it on the middle of the snare, and you can measure to each of your microphones and make sure you're the same distance away or very close. Now, there is a variety of this, which people call Recorder Man. I'm not going to set it up because I don't want to move things right now, but that adds the second mic over the shoulder, similar to where we had it in the previous example, pointing down at the tom and the kick drum. So more in this way and down. It's an interesting variety. Maybe we'll do a comparison between Glyn Johns and Recorder Man at some point, but for now, just know that this mic position can move. And remember, what you hear from the microphone has to determine your mic placement. So you're going to have to try these. You're going to have to move them around, listen to your results, decide what you hear, what you get too much of, and understand your microphone's pickup patterns so you can figure out how to change the positioning. A figure 8 and a cardioid, or an omni, if you happen to have anything that does omni, are all going to have different relationships to what's happening around them, especially with this cymbal and other things that could wash in from the side. So anyway, that's Glyn Johns. Oh, yes. One more note. When we're talking about overheads on a boom, not everybody can afford a super expensive studio boom. This is not a super expensive studio boom. This is $100 on stage. And it can be a little bit microphone heavy when you get it out at length. Not the heaviest counterweight. In comes a bag, and inside the bag is a brick. It's very deluxe, but totally functional. And if I loosen this arm, it's basically balanced. It's not going anywhere. So that's really the thing to do with the counterweight, is figure out where is it going to balance properly, and make sure you have proper counterweighting. It's much better to take a little precaution than have to replace a microphone because it falls to the ground. And one fall to the ground with a ribbon mic, it can be toast. While I'm setting up microphones, I thought it might be good to just discuss mic placement. These are going to be things in general on mic placement, but it's important to have an idea of what you want the instrument to sound like. That means putting your ear down in front of the instrument, listening to what's coming out, and then deciding where you want to capture it from. What sort of placement is going to give you the tone you want. In the case of a bass drum, you want to have a solid foundation on the low end, a big bottom. You want to have a crisp slap on the top. If you have to EQ and boost things to get what you missed, you're also boosting bleed. You're boosting anything that might be destructive. So it's a really important thing to get something that captures the way you want that instrument to sound full frequency right off the get-go. With this bass drum, it meant the batter side, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. For a snare drum or the toms, the angle of approach is going to make a difference. 30 degree, 45 degree, whatever the case may be. Straight down into the drum. All of these are going to have a different tone. I find a shallow angle works pretty well. I do about 45 degrees on the tom. You can see I'm measuring with 3 or 4 fingers to get a consistent distance from the drum. Proximity effect comes into play with all of these. The closer you are to the head of the drum, or the closer to a guitar speaker, closer to a voice, you're going to get more low end and kind of a bigger, more hyped tone. Further away is a little more natural, a little more balanced and focused. So what works for you, you're going to have to experiment with. If you place the microphone further away, you're going to get more bleed, more cymbal wash. Closer may not produce the tone you're looking for, so there's a balancing act. But experiment and listen, and don't be afraid to stick your head in front of the instrument and hear what it is before you put a microphone there to figure out where you want to put it. Choosing microphone by style, Dynamics are going to handle the loud volume of a drum. These condensers have a pad, so I can get the more detailed tone of a condenser microphone and still not distort. So we're editing the video, and Dave Solo, my intern, thanks again for the help, Dave, asked me a question about the kick drum. I had a little bit of an unconventional placement of the kick drum on the batter side, and the reason I do that is I want to get the slap of the beater on the head. This particular bass drum, which is my favorite, it's a mid-60s Rogers, and I like it with no hole in the resonant side. No hole in the resonant side of the bass drum gives a much rounder, boomier, more low-end kind of tone, but you can't put the microphone inside the drum to get up close to the beater, which is a normal position. This position here, if I was doing something like a jazz record or a folk record where I don't want a lot of beater definition, this could work for a single mic. But typically, I want to hear the slap. I can EQ it down if I need less of it, but I can't get it if it's not there. So I tend, with a solid resonant head on a bass drum, to mic the other side, the batter side. And we will discuss phase with whether or not this is on one side or the other versus the overheads and versus everything else in a future video. But just a quick note on the bass drum to answer the first question I got while making the film. So we've arrived now on stereo overheads and tight mics on everything. I could make a record like this anytime. There's really not anything that I would say is missing. It may not have as much ambience as if we had room mics. It may not have as much detail to sculpt the snare drum afterwards without a top and bottom mic, but this is a totally usable drum setup. There's more that we can add, and we'll go into that in the next video, but 6 mics on a drum kit is really plenty enough to make a record that's going to sound great. We need to talk some more about treatment, and that's going to be in the next video. We're going to talk about phase alignment, phase coherency. We'll talk about signal processing with compressors and EQ. But in the meanwhile, thank you very much for being here for our second video. Be sure to click subscribe, leave some comments below. What do you want to hear? What kind of questions do you have? Hit the bell for notifications. Find me on social media, and I'll see you next time.